I want you to think about something for a second. Think about the moment when you're walking down a quiet street at night and somewhere behind you something shifts. Not loud, not dramatic, just a shift, a scrape of gravel maybe, a change in the way the air moves. And your whole body does something your brain hasn't caught up to yet. Your shoulders go tight. Your eyes move faster. Every hair on your arm stands up straight. That's not fear exactly, not yet. That's recognition. Your body knows something before your mind does. It knows because something buried deep inside you, something older than language, older than memory, is reading the environment and saying, there is a predator nearby. Now imagine you've never felt that before. Imagine you grew up on a world where the food chains were different, where your species sat at the top always, without competition, where nothing in your evolutionary history ever needed to develop that prickling, full-body warning system, where you never learned what it felt like to be prey. That's where Envoy Kalen Voss was standing when it happened. And I'm telling you, I was 3 meters away from him. I watched his face go through about 15 different expressions in the span of maybe 4 seconds, and not a single one of those expressions had a name in his language. Because his language never needed those words. Section II, the setup. Helix Station, Meridian, is one of those places that looks like someone took the word cosmopolitan and turned it into a building. It sits at the edge of the Velara corridor, that long stretch of navigable deep space between the outer settlements and the old coalition territory, and it's been a transit hub, a diplomatic way station, and an unofficial neutral ground for about 60 galactic years. If you want to get from anywhere in the lower quadrant to anywhere in the upper, you pass through Meridian. If you want to negotiate something delicate without it happening on anyone's home turf, you do it at Meridian. If you want to see what 63 sapient species look like when they're all trying to share a food court, you go to Meridian. It smells like 100 different things at once. Not all of them pleasant, not all of them describable using standard atmospheric reference charts. The lighting in the main concourse shifts based on time zone of origin, which means one section of the hall is bathed in deep amber, and 20 meters over it's blue-white and clinical, and somewhere in between there's a strip of near-ultraviolet that only 3 species can actually perceive. The floors are a composite of magnetic rail tracks and anti-slip polymer, because some of the species transiting the station have feet, and some have 3, and one species, the Thalin, has what can only be described as the concept of movement made biological, and they don't really touch the floor at all. The station's primary hub, Docking Ring 7, was undergoing a routine diplomatic shuffle the day this happened. 3 separate delegations were in transit at the same time, which was unusual but not unheard of, and the station's coordination staff were running about 8 minutes behind schedule because one of the hegemony courier ships had filed its docking paperwork 17 minutes late. I was there in a professional capacity. I work for the Galactic Cultural Exchange Commission, which is a fancy title for a job that mostly involves standing in hallways watching species from different planets try to figure out each other's social cues without causing an interplanetary incident. My specific assignment that rotation was to serve as a cultural liaison for a small Vorathian delegation, 5 envoys, including Kalen Voss, who were making their first transit through human-administered space. The Vorathi are not a small species. They average about 2.5 meters in height. They have a bilateral symmetry that's almost human but not quite, 4 arms instead of 2, positioned in staggered pairs along the torso, with a second set of sensory organs high on the back that they use for ambient environmental reading. They're extremely sophisticated. Ancient civilization, incredibly advanced biotechnology, a philosophical tradition that dates back longer than human literacy. They were not, in any way, naive or unsophisticated travelers. They just had no cultural framework for humans in a crisis. Most species don't the first time. We'd been in docking ring 7 for about 40 minutes, waiting for the transit clearance to process, when the situation started to develop. I noticed it before the Vorathi did, not because I'm especially perceptive, but because I was watching the human staff working the docking bay, and I'd spent enough time with humans to know that something in their body language had changed. Specifically, I was watching a woman named Sergeant Danny Rellos. She was stationed at the primary security booth at the far end of the ring, and she'd been doing the same job for about 3 hours at that point, checking transit documents, running bioscan confirmation, directing foot traffic. Standard. Routine. She had the particular expression that humans get when they're performing a task their body could do without their conscious mind being fully involved. Not bored exactly, just elsewhere. Running on muscle memory, while some quieter part of their brain thought about other things. And then something changed. I watched it happen in real time, and I'm still not entirely sure I can describe it accurately. It wasn't one thing. It was a collection of tiny things, happening so fast they looked like a single event. Her shoulders dropped about half a centimeter and then locked. Her chin came up just slightly. Her eyes, which had been moving in that routine sweep-and-return pattern of practice security work, stopped their sweep and fixed on something across the ring. That was all, maybe 1.5 seconds of visible change. But something in my chest responded to it before I understood why. I turned to look where she was looking. Section III, the build. Across docking ring 7, about 60 meters from where Sergeant Rellos was stationed, 3 beings in consolidated hegemony military uniforms had just entered through the transit corridor from Pad 14. The consolidated hegemony is one of the larger multi-species political structures in the upper quadrant. Not technically hostile to the Earth Compact, but not exactly comfortable with it either. The two entities had been in a period of what the diplomatic corps like to call structured disagreement for about 14 years, which was a polite way of saying they argued constantly about trade access, mineral rights in the Velara corridor, and the appropriate level of military presence near the neutral buffer zones. The soldiers, 2 Hrathari and 1 Deruvian, were moving through the docking ring in a way that was technically within station protocols, but was also unmistakably a statement. The Hrathari in particular had a way of occupying space that was clearly intentional. They were large even by galactic standards, broad, heavily reinforced skeletons wrapped in combat-rated exoplating that was technically classified as dress uniform, but was functionally indistinguishable from light armor. Their stride was wide and unhurried, and they were moving down the center of the transit corridor in a way that forced the civilian foot traffic to part around them. The Deruvian, smaller and more angular, was carrying what the hegemony officially registered as a ceremonial honor blade, which is legal at Meridian under diplomatic transit provisions, provided the weapon remained secured. It was not secured. The blade was visible, sheathed but unclipped from the security housing, which meant it could be drawn without the standard 3-second safety delay. This was a violation of Meridian protocol. A minor one technically, but also a deliberate one, the kind of minor violation that says we know the rule and we're telling you what we think of it. I watched Sergeant Rellos register this from 60 meters away. And here's the thing, and I want to be precise about this because it's important. She didn't reach for her comm. She didn't signal for backup. She didn't show any visible agitation. She just looked for about 2 seconds, and then she stepped out from behind her security booth and started walking toward them. I felt Envoy Kalen Voss standing at my shoulder shift his weight. He'd noticed her movement. The human security officer is approaching the military contingent, he murmured in standard galactic. She appears to be unescorted. Is this a greeting protocol? No, I said. Is she required to address the protocol violation personally? Not required, I said. She chose to. He watched her walk. She is significantly smaller than the Hrathari individuals. Yes, I said. I didn't add anything to that. There wasn't really anything useful to add. Across the ring, other people were noticing. There were maybe 90 beings in docking ring 7 at that moment, a mix of species, mostly civilian travelers, a few other transit staff. The ones with sufficient social intelligence to read the situation were already doing what crowds do when they sense something developing. They were slowing down, creating space, turning slightly. The Vorathi delegation, all 5 of them, had oriented toward the developing situation with a precision that was almost architectural. 4 sets of rear sensory organs were up and active, reading the ambient emotional atmosphere of the room. Kalen Voss had gone very still. The Hrathari soldiers saw Sergeant Rellos coming toward them and did not slow down. This was also a statement. You walked toward us, the movement said, so we let you come to us. She crossed about 40 meters of open floor and stopped directly in their path. Not to the side, not at an angle, directly in their path about 3 meters ahead of them, which meant they either stopped or walked through her. They stopped. The lead Hrathari, enormous, easily 2 full meters and then some, with the broad cranial ridge that indicated high military rank in their hierarchy, looked down at her with an expression that the Hrathari use when they're establishing what they consider the correct relational dynamic between parties. In their culture, this translates loosely to, I acknowledge your existence in the context of your functional irrelevance. Sergeant Rellos looked back up at him. She was maybe 165, 170 in height. In her gray and blue transit security uniform, she looked, I want to be honest here, she looked like someone who should, statistically speaking, be in a very different situation than the one she'd chosen to put herself in. She said something. I couldn't hear it from where I was standing, the ambient noise of the ring was too high, but I could see her lips, and I could see the Hrathari's response. He said something back, longer. The Deruvian made a small lateral movement that translated in most cultures as amusement. Sergeant Rellos nodded once. Then she held out her hand, palm up. I knew what she was asking for. She was asking the Deruvian to surrender the honor blade, or to resecure it to the housing, or to explain why it wasn't secured. She was standing there, one human woman, in the middle of a transit ring full of beings from 63 species, holding out her hand to a hegemony military party that outweighed her combined by roughly 800 kilograms, and she was saying, give me the blade or secure it or explain yourself. The Hrathari looked at her hand, then back at her face, then at her hand again. He said something. She nodded again and kept her hand extended. Behind me, Kalen Voss exhaled slowly through his secondary respiration slits, which is the Vorathi equivalent of a sharp breath. She is still asking, he said. Yes, I said. She is still asking without any apparent escalation, despite the refusal. She's not escalating, I agreed. Not yet. Is she waiting for something? I thought about how to answer that. She's giving them a moment, I said finally, to make the right choice. Section IV, the shift. The moment lasted about 12 seconds. 12 seconds is not a long time in most contexts. In the middle of a diplomatic standoff in a crowded transit hub, 12 seconds is a very long time. The Deruvian made the decision for the group. In a gesture that was probably meant to look casual, the kind of deliberate casualness that is actually the opposite of casual, he reached up and unclipped the honor blade from its sheath entirely and held it loosely at his side. Not drawn, not raised, just held. In his hand, unhoused, pointing at the floor. A challenge, a soft one technically, we see your rule. We're telling you what we think of your rule. And here's the moment I want to tell you about. The moment I've thought about probably 100 times since it happened, and every time I think about it, I understand a little bit more, and I still don't have the right words for all of it. Sergeant Rellos looked at the blade. Then she looked up at the Deruvian's face. And something happened. I don't know how to describe it precisely. I've tried a lot of times. The closest I can get is this. She became something different. Not physically, she didn't change position, didn't shift her weight, didn't do anything theatrical, but something in the quality of her stillness changed. Like the air around her changed consistency. Like a switch was thrown somewhere very deep inside her, and whatever was on the before side of that switch was completely different from whatever was on the after side. The Hrathari noticed it. I know this because I watched his cranial ridge, which had been angled in that posture of dismissive authority, drop about 2 centimeters. Not much, but in Hrathari body language, that's like another species taking a small, involuntary step backward. His secondary eyes, mounted on the sides of his head, rotated slightly toward his companion. A quick, involuntary movement. Did you see that? The Deruvian had seen it. The blade was still in his hand. Sergeant Rellos didn't move. She didn't speak. She just looked at the Deruvian with a quality of attention that I have genuinely never seen in any other species I've encountered in 12 years of xenocultural work. It was not rage. It wasn't anything close to rage. It was something quieter and stranger and considerably more ancient than rage. It was patience. Not passive patience. Not the patience of someone who is waiting for something to happen. The patience of something that has decided a thing is going to happen and is simply organizing, allocating, getting ready at some deep biological level in a way that has nothing to do with conscious choice and everything to do with something your body learned millions of years before you were born. The Hrathari soldier, and I cannot stress enough that this being was nearly twice her height, combat-rated, representing a military culture that has been expanding aggressively for 300 years, took a very small step backward. Not a retreat. He would tell you, and it would be technically true, that he simply shifted his weight. But I was watching, and Kalen Voss was watching, and everyone in that ring who had been slowly orienting toward the developing situation was watching. He stepped back, and the Deruvian, making a very sudden, very different calculation, reached down and reclicked the honor blade into its security housing. The 3-second delay mechanism engaged with a soft, audible lock. Done. Over. The Hrathari straightened, produced his transit documents without further instruction, presented them to Sergeant Rellos. She processed them with exactly the same professional efficiency she'd been using for the previous 3 hours. Not smug, not triumphant, not anything except working. She directed them to their connecting corridor. They went. She walked back to her security booth, sat down, resumed the document sweep. And docking ring 7, after about 4 full seconds of absolute collective silence, slowly went back to being a busy transit hub. Section V, the aftermath KALENVOSS. I turned to Kalen Voss. All 5 Varathi were still oriented toward the space where it had happened, even though there was nothing to see there anymore. Their rear sensory organs were still active, which they generally aren't unless they're processing something they haven't fully resolved. Envoy, I said carefully. He took a moment to turn toward me, another moment to find appropriate language. What, he said, was that? I thought about it. That's a complicated question, I said. Then give me a complicated answer. I looked across the ring at Sergeant Rellos, who was now processing the documents of a small Thalan family, completely ordinary, already gone somewhere else in her attention. Humans, I said, have a predator mode. Kalen Voss was quiet for a second. All species with predatory heritage have behavioral states associated with threat response. Right, I said. But most species, most of the ones we deal with, their threat response is expressive. It signals. It makes them bigger, louder, more visible. It's designed to communicate danger so that conflict can maybe be avoided. This is standard, he said. Human threat response doesn't work like that, I said. Or it does sometimes. When humans are frightened, they can be expressive about it, sure. But humans didn't climb to the top of their food chain by looking dangerous. They did it by being patient, by tracking, by pursuing things over long distances until those things were simply exhausted. They ran their prey into the ground. Literally. That's a thing they did. They'd chase an animal for hours, sometimes an entire day, at a steady, relentless pace, until the animal couldn't run anymore, and then they'd be standing right there. Persistence hunting, Kalen Voss said. His translator was working, he had the term. Yes, and that behavior, that deep evolutionary behavior, it's still in there. When a human enters that mode, they don't get louder, they get quieter, they get more efficient. All the energy that other species put into signaling threat, humans redirect inward, toward the actual problem. And something about the specific quality of that stillness, reads as deeply threatening to the threat recognition systems of other predatory species, because it looks like what it is. It looks like something that has decided it's going to finish what it started. Kalen Voss was quiet for a long time. The Hrathari retreated, he said finally, from a being less than 2/3 his height with no visible weapons. Yes. Because of that quality. Yes. He looked across the ring. Is that conscious? Does she know she does that? Some of it, I said. Trained soldiers know a version of it, but a lot of it is below conscious control. It's not a strategy she deployed. It's something that happens to her when the right conditions are met, like a switch. The Deruvian resecured the weapon, Kalen Voss said, and there was something in his voice I couldn't quite name. Without being asked again, without any escalation. Because the calculus changed, I said. Suddenly the situation wasn't, we are demonstrating our disregard for a procedural rule in front of a low-stakes security officer. Suddenly the situation was, we are in a confined space with something that has decided it is prepared to pursue this to conclusion. And that's a different situation. One of the other Vorathi envoys, a younger one whose name I was still learning to pronounce, something like Sith Varun, moved closer. We have a word in Old Vorathi, he said. It was used to describe a class of predators on our homeworld before we domesticated the biosphere. The translation is closest to the ones who finish. I looked at him. That is what she looked like, he said. She looked like a thing that finishes. Section VI, the long view, a wider context. That evening, after the delegation had been cleared to their transit berths, I filed my standard cultural liaison report and then sat in the station's observation gallery for a while, looking out at the stars. There's a lot of traffic through Meridian at any given time. Cargo freighters from the outer settlements, diplomatic couriers from a dozen different governmental bodies, civilian transports, research vessels, the occasional hegemony patrol ship running its presence assertion routes along the corridor. You can watch them come and go for hours and never see the same configuration twice. I was thinking about what Sith Varun had said. The ones who finish. I've been working as a cultural liaison for 12 years, which means I've spent 12 years trying to help species understand each other. It's genuinely the most interesting job in the galaxy, and also sometimes the most exhausting, because most of the misunderstandings aren't about facts or policies or territorial disagreements. They're about this: species encountering something in another species that has no equivalent in their own experience and having no framework for processing it. Humans are, and I say this as someone who has worked with and alongside and occasionally underneath human institutions for my entire career, unusual. Not in every way. In a lot of ways, humans are remarkably similar to other social sapient species. They form family groups. They have complex language systems. They engage in art, music, ritual. They care about their children with a ferocity that most species recognize and respond to intuitively. But this thing, this predator mode, as I described it to Kalen Voss, although that was a simplification, This is something different. This is something that requires explanation before other species can encounter it without being completely blindsided. I've seen versions of what happened in Docking Ring 7 play out in a dozen contexts over my career. I've seen it in human military deployments, in human emergency response, in human medical personnel when a situation goes critical, in human negotiators at diplomatic tables when the other side decides to push too hard. The scale and context changes, but the essential pattern is the same. Something in the environment signals this has become serious, and the human in question shifts, and the shift is remarkable to witness. The thing that makes it remarkable isn't that it's terrifying exactly, it's that it's calm. Because that's what the other species aren't expecting. They're expecting visible threat display, larger, louder, more armored, more agitated. That's the grammar of conflict across most of the sapient species in the coalition. You signal danger so conflict can be preempted. And then, if it can't be preempted, you make yourself look large enough and terrifying enough that the other party recalculates. Humans don't do that, or they do sometimes, but the deeper mode is different. The deeper mode is a quiet, specific, relentless focus that reads, at some fundamental level, as the behavior of something that has already decided how this ends. And that, it turns out, is one of the most unsettling things a sapient being can encounter, regardless of its species or its size or its military capability. Because it says, I am not trying to convince you I'm dangerous. I am simply prepared to demonstrate it for as long as it takes until we reach the end of this. There's no bluff in it. That's what the HFY soldier read in 12 seconds across 60 meters of transit hub. That's why he stepped back. Section VII. The report Sergeant Rellos speaks. I tracked down Sergeant Rellos 3 days after the incident. I wanted to include her account in my commission report, and I also, if I'm honest, wanted to understand it better. She agreed to a recorded interview in the station staff briefing room, a spare, practical space, folding chairs and a wall screen and a coffee unit that needed descaling about 6 maintenance cycles ago. She came in off a 14-hour shift, still in uniform, and she had the particular quality of tiredness that very competent people have, the kind that doesn't actually slow them down, it just makes them more direct. She sat down across from me and wrapped both hands around a coffee mug and waited for me to start. The incident in Docking Ring 7, I said, 3 days ago, the hegemony military transit party. Can you walk me through what you were thinking? She thought for a moment, not because the question was hard, I don't think, just organizing. I was thinking about the protocol violation, she said. The unhoused blade, that's a clear violation. I've written up 4 of those in the last 2 years. Usually it's an honest mistake species who aren't familiar with Meridian's weapon policies, or travelers who have their paperwork in order but misread the staging requirements. Easy to resolve. But this one felt different, I said. This one was intentional, she said, without any judgment in it, matter of fact. The way they came in, the way they moved through the corridor, they knew the policy. The unhoused blade was a choice. She paused. That changes the nature of the conversation. How so? She looked at her coffee. An honest mistake is an administrative problem. A deliberate violation is a posture, and you address a posture differently than you address an administrative problem. How do you address a posture? By being clearer than they were, she said. About what? She looked up at me. About where this goes if they make us do this the hard way. I thought about how to ask the next thing. The HFY soldier stepped back, I said. She nodded. He's significantly larger than you. A lot of beings are, she said, with a very slight something at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile but was in the same family. Were you afraid? She thought about it, which I appreciated. She didn't give me the reflexive answer. Aware, she said finally. I was aware. The size differential is relevant data. The combat capability is relevant data. The political weight of the Hegemony Commission is relevant data. I'm aware of all of that. But it doesn't change what the protocol requires, she said. It doesn't change what the job is. And once I've committed to addressing the situation, the most productive thing I can do is be clear about what I'm prepared to do and for how long. What were you prepared to do? She looked at me steadily. Whatever was necessary for as long as it took. I believed her. I believed it in the way I'd believed it watching from 60 meters away, and I think that was the point. It wasn't a performance. There was nothing in her to perform with. She simply meant it, in a way that registered at a level below language. The Deruvian resecured the blade, I said. Yes. You didn't have to escalate. No, she said. Usually you don't. Usually once they understand what they're actually looking at, the math changes fast. She turned the coffee mug in her hands. Most species in the coalition aren't used to something that's willing to just go all the way, without a ceiling on it. They're used to threats that have a negotiable upper limit. I'll do X unless you do Y. Human threat response doesn't work like that. I described it to Vorathi Envoy as predator mode, I said. That's a reasonable way to put it, she said. He described you as looking like something that finishes things. She was quiet for a moment. That's also a reasonable way to put it, she said. Section VIII, the science and the history. I want to spend a moment on context, because I think context matters here. I think what happened in Docking Ring 7 makes more sense when you understand where it comes from. Humans evolved on a mid-size rocky planet in a moderate star system, in conditions that were, by galactic standards, genuinely challenging. Earth has tectonic instability, significant atmospheric variability, temperature ranges that span more than 100 degrees across its surface, and an evolutionary history characterized by intense competition and constant environmental pressure. The species that came up through that environment developed a lot of interesting adaptations. But the one that matters most for this conversation is persistence. Human beings are not the fastest animals on their planet. They are not the strongest. They are not the most armored, the most toxic, or the most physically imposing. On a raw capability comparison, they lose to a fairly long list of other species from their own biosphere. But they are among the most persistent creatures ever to evolve anywhere in the known galaxy. Their bodies regulate heat with unusual efficiency, a combination of reduced body hair, a uniquely dense distribution of sweat glands, and a cardiovascular system that is extraordinary by galactic standards in its ability to sustain aerobic output over extended periods. They can run, not fast but far, and at a pace that most prey animals, optimized for speed, cannot maintain for the duration required to outlast a human pursuit. They literally chased things until those things fell over. For most of Earth's evolutionary history, this was how humans hunted large prey, not with superior strength or speed, with patience, with tracking, with a relentless, sustained, utterly unhurried commitment to the pursuit that ended when the prey was exhausted and the human was still moving. The ones who finish. And here is the thing about an evolutionary strategy based on persistence. It requires a very particular psychological profile to execute. You can't pursue something for 8 hours at a steady pace while also being frightened. Fear is metabolically expensive. Panic is metabolically expensive. Excessive threat display is metabolically expensive. All of the energy that other predatory species allocate to looking dangerous, the human persistence hunter has to allocate to staying on the trail. So human threat response, at its deepest biological level, isn't about looking big or sounding dangerous. It's about becoming efficient, about routing available cognitive and physical resources away from everything non-essential and toward the single, specific, sustained task of seeing this through to conclusion. What Kalen Voss saw when Sergeant Rellos looked at the Deruvian's unhoused blade was the surface expression of a couple million years of that. A being that had just made a determination. A being that had rooted non-essential functions offline and was now organizing itself around a single, sustained task. A being that was, at a fundamental biological level, settling in for however long it took. That's what stepped out of Sergeant Relos's eyes in that moment. And the Hrathari soldier, born into a predatory military culture, with excellent threat recognition instincts, genuinely capable of correctly reading danger signals across species lines, looked at it and did the math in about 4 seconds. This is a thing that will not stop. This will not negotiate. This has already accepted whatever cost is required to see this through. That's a very particular kind of opponent to be standing in front of. The step backward was the only logical response. Section IX, other species react. Word travels fast on a station like Meridian. By the next morning, what had happened in Docking Ring 7 was being discussed in at least 6 different species communication channels that I'm aware of, and probably more that I'm not. Not as a major incident. It hadn't escalated. No one had been hurt. From a protocol standpoint, it was almost entirely unremarkable. Minor violation, addressed, resolved, documented. But the thing itself, the moment, was traveling. I got a communication from a Thalan cultural observer who'd been in the ring and wanted to compare notes. The Thalan, who experienced space as something closer to a continuous field than a collection of objects, had perceived what they described as a localized coherence event, their terminology for when a being's intentional and physical presence become very precisely aligned. They find it rare, and they find it striking, and they'd been watching Sergeant Rellos from about 20 meters when it happened. I got an inquiry from a Kethori academic on Meridian's research deck, who was compiling a long-term study on human behavioral phenotypes in high-stakes environments. He'd been monitoring the ring's ambient sensors as part of his data collection and had picked up the event on 3 separate readouts. He wanted to correlate it with my observational data. I got a personal message from one of the junior Vorathi envoys, not Kalen Voss, but one of the others, whose name I'd learned by then was Threvel Kaz. It said, simply, "I have been thinking about what the human did. I do not have vocabulary for all of what I am thinking, but I believe this is significant." And I got a very unexpected communication from an officer on the hegemony courier ship that the Hrathari soldiers had transited through. He did not identify himself by name. The message came through a third-party relay, which is what you do when you're on a military vessel and you want to communicate something unofficially. It said, "Please convey to the human security officer that her conduct was noted and respected. This is personal, not official. Please do not reply to this channel." I did not reply to that channel. But I did note it. Because that's interesting, isn't it? That's the hegemony military, which has been running territorial aggression plays in the Velara corridor for 14 years, finding an unofficial channel to send a private message of respect to one human security officer working a transit desk on a neutral station. Her conduct was noted and respected because she didn't back down and didn't escalate and didn't perform anything. She just became what she was, fully, without apology, and let the situation resolve around that. Section X, KALENVOSS, the conversation that followed. Kalen Voss requested a formal conversation with me 2 days into the delegation's transit period. Not about policy or diplomatic affairs. He was very clear about that. He wanted to talk about what he'd seen. We sat in one of the station's smaller meeting rooms, better furniture than the staff briefing room, at least, and he sat across from me with that particular Vorathi stillness that looks like they're always slightly processing more than they're showing, and he said, "I want to understand the human relationship with fear." I said, "What specifically?" Most species that evolved in competitive environments have a direct relationship between fear and threat response. The threat triggers fear. Fear triggers the display. The display serves as a deterrent or a warning. The sequence is legible. He folded two of his four hands together on the table. The human threat response I observed did not include visible fear. The response I observed appeared to eliminate fear, or not eliminate. Integrate. Yes, I said, that's a good way to put it. How does that work? I thought about it for a while. It's not that humans don't feel fear, I said. They do. Functionally, biochemically, they have the same fear response as most sapient species. It serves the same baseline warning functions. But humans have a long history, evolutionary and cultural, of operating through fear rather than being redirected by it. They have an entire cultural tradition built around this. Stories about it. Training systems built to cultivate it. They value it as an attribute, specifically because their ancestral environment required it. The persistence hunting, he said. He'd done reading of his own, apparently. Yes, you can't run something down over 8 hours while you're panicking. You have to be able to feel the danger and keep moving anyway. So humans evolved a capacity, and then culturally reinforced that capacity, to feel fear as information rather than as a stop signal. He was quiet for a while. In Vorathi philosophy, he said finally, there is a concept I am working on the translation. The closest I can get is the difference between an obstacle and a wall. An obstacle can be worked around or overcome. A wall is a boundary beyond which you cannot go. Many sapient beings, when they encounter danger, experience it as a wall, a boundary that redirects behavior. And for humans, I said. When that human looked at the Deruvian's weapon, he said, she was not looking at a wall. She was looking at an obstacle. Yes, I said. She was not calculating the risk of proceeding. She was calculating the process of proceeding. Yes. He was quiet again. This is a profound difference, he said. It is. The Hrathari soldier recognized it. His instincts recognized it, I said, before his conscious mind probably did, because at a threat recognition level, there is something very specific about the difference between a being that sees a wall and a being that sees an obstacle. The body language is different. The quality of attention is different. And beings with good predatory instincts, which the Hrathari absolutely have, can read that difference, even across species lines. They stepped back because she was not deterred, Kalen Voss said. More than that, I said. They stepped back because she was not deterrable, because there was nothing in her body language, nothing in her affect, nothing in the quality of her attention that suggested there was a price high enough to make her stop. He sat with that for a long moment. That is a terrifying thing to encounter, he said. Most species think so, I agreed. And it is also, he said more slowly, a remarkable thing to know exists, on your side.